Welcome back, beautiful tri state area. You're listening to a moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York, iHeart Radio. I'm your host, Zen Sams. Up in just a few minutes in our entertainment and pop culture segment brought to you by Animoca Brands, we're featuring iHeart's very own Ken Dashow from a Q104.3. He's on air weekdays 2 to 7 p.m. With Ken, it's a no politics fun zone filled with great music, free concert tickets, and live performances. Whether it's rocking the workday afternoon and drive home or breakfast with the Beatles on Sunday mornings, Ken sums it up in 3 words: long live rock. And with that, he's here today to help me celebrate our 102nd episode on WOR Rock and Roll Style, the genre responsible for Elvis, the Beatles, headbanging, leather pants, Stairway to Heaven, and a lot of smashed up hotel rooms. What started in the 1950s when black and white culture collided in the United States quickly boiled over and spread throughout the world. While there's still a little bit of debate among rock and roll scholars as to who exactly kicked the whole thing off, there's no denying that the 1950s were where it all began. Welcoming now to the show is the amazing Ken Dashow. Welcome, superstar.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you, Sid. It's great to be on the show. And, being a Q, we're all the iHeart family, WOR, right down the hall, and love you guys. When we had sports, I would come over after my show and talk sports on the air. So, it's one family. It really is. It's great to see you. You look great.
Thank you. So excited to chat with you. So thank you for being here today.
Sure.
Now, let's dive right in. So Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bill Haley, and of course Elvis Presley became the giants of the 50s, each carving out different avenues for future rock and rollers to walk down. Who is your favorite all-time rock and roller or rock band, and how has rock and roll evolved over the years in your point of view?
It's something I've always imagined. I didn't read it, and if you don't agree with me, that's fine. But the folks you mentioned, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Elvis, Bo Diddley, all those guys, they built the foundation of the house that is rock and roll music. Before that, it was always like beautiful music. It was just a new generation of people singing older music. But that was rhythm and blues. That was rock and roll. And that's what made it so dangerous is they were playing quote unquote black music, but they were white people. So white kids were dancing to black music. And
And
we can't have that in
can't have
England
that.
or here. That was terrifying. And then, well, it'll pass. It'll pass. But then Elvis took it to that next level. And Elvis became the biggest star there was in music. And he's still singing black music. Now,
Imagine that.
I mean, and that was the Alan Freed. That's why they had to stop rock and roll. So that's the foundation. And then along come the Beatles, and they do it in England. And Elvis is in this beautiful, gorgeous pink Cadillac with big fenders and gorgeous. And the Beatles come along in a rocket ship. Go, thanks, Elvis. We learned everything from you. And
And
off
stole
they
it right off. And that's my next question. So during the 50s, Britain was perfectly placed to be the biggest consumer of rock and roll outside of the USA. And then came along, like you said, Cliff Richard, the first unique British rocker who set the scene for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, both of whom would dominate the 1960s. And later that decade, Beatlemania, poof, swept the world, and Britain was the biggest exporter of rock and roll. Why are the Beatles still so popular after all these years, Ken?
You know, I love that question, and I've probably been asked it 1,000 times, and I love it because it's the answer of what it is. Every generation loves their own music that you grew up on, and then that's your parents' music, and you move on. Why 50 years on are the Beatles still important? Because of the message. If the Beatles stayed in 1964, "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah," that was an explosion. That was Beatlemania. They were the first band to ever evolve. If you think about it, Elvis was always Elvis. A country act is a country act. The Beatles were the first one who they did Beatlemania Mop Tops for 2 years, threw that away, stopped touring, and then they start becoming more psychedelic. And they and Bob Dylan are the foundations of the house that everything is built on. Bob Dylan met the Beatles and said, "Okay, you've got the world's attention. Now say something."
Yes.
And that
So
might have
true.
and listen, I believe that would have happened anyway, but when Bob Dylan dragged folk music into rock and roll, kicking and screaming, he was the first folkie to go electric, and it blew everybody's minds. And the Beatles, instead of singing "She Loves You," the "Yeah, Yeah, Yeah," they write Eleanor Rigby. They
Yeah.
write "Yesterday." They write "Tomorrow Never Knows," "Turn Off Your Mind and Float Downstream," and it
Yeah.
changes the world. And to this day, that feeling of alienation Not just, "Oh, I love you, girl. I wanna be with you." That sense of what's life about? How do I fit in? And then the message of hope, all you need is love. We
Oh,
get we get by with a little help from our friends as the world's being torn apart politically and with bombs in the Ukraine. The answer, all you need is love. We get by with a little help from our friends.
and here comes the sun.
Here comes the sun. It's getting better all the time. To
Yeah.
believe in that when you're lost, or you feel hopeless, or you're a teenager, or you're 60 years old, it's a message of hope. It's a friendship.
Ah,
The there so many people I've learned so much from other musicians and rockers about what they meant, what they were taught by the Beatles, and everyone said there's a musician, Randy Bachman, he was American Woman from the Guess Who and then BTO, Taking Care of Business, and he
yeah.
said, "I always get asked, did you ever have formal musical training?" And he says, "Yes, I listened to the Beatles."
There you go. And the 70s saw the rise of disco, punk rock, and glam rock as the horizon of rock and roll expanded further and further into this new territory. And rock and roll was turning bands into gods who started flying in private jets on world tours, playing to arenas of adoring fans. I mean, Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Kiss, Elton John, ABBA, and the Bee Gees were just some of the biggest groups of the decade, each shaping new sounds and styles for audiences around the world. And they were all very unique in their own way. But by the 1980s, rock and roll was entering its midlife crisis. And in my opinion, the genre was really unrecognizable from its early roots. Commercially speaking, Ken, rock and roll was in decline. I mean, Guns N' Roses, Def Leppard, Queen, and Prince each became giants in the rock and roll world, taking the throne from the bands that had come before. Why do you feel that during the 1980s, rock and roll became best friends with sex and drugs?
Well, it always was. I mean, that's rock and roll was always about sex, drugs, and rock and roll because that was the danger of it. Alan Freed, the first rock and roll disc jockey who did dance parties. He had
Yep.
touring rock shows. And the reason that, J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI set out on a mission to destroy him is for one reason and one reason only. Black kids and white kids were dancing. They
Yeah,
weren't fighting, they were dancing together, and we can't have that. And then the same thing was happening in England. As you said, rock and roll was the biggest export that England had in the '60s, '70s, and the government did everything they could to stop it. As opposed to encouraging it, they tried you had to go on a ship, pirate radio. If we were rock DJs
yeah,
in England in the '60s, we'd have to be on a ship 20 miles offshore in order to play these records, right,
crazy.
because the BBC would not allow this filth, this dangerous satanic sound.
Yep.
And, and that became so there's Black Sabbath with dark metal imagery, and then there's beautiful synth pop that came in the '80s, Eurythmics and, Human League and things like that. What I've always felt is that rock and roll has the biggest tent on the music fairground. There's rock, there's Guns N' Roses, there's Patti Smith, there's Bob Dylan, there's the Beatles, there's Ozzy Osbourne. Come on in, the beer's cold, there's plenty of chairs. You'll find where you wanna sit, and you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. And by the 1990s, rock and roll was fading out of the mainstream as hip hop and R&B dominated commercial radio and MTV. More artists experimented with new techniques and technology. Enter grunge. What started as an underground sound in Seattle spread like wildflower through the United States and across the world as bands like Pearl Jam and Nirvana dominated the airwaves. Ken, in contrast to this heavily distorted sound, bands like REM, Beck, Oasis, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers also made a name for themselves by incorporating new styles and sounds. I mean, rock and roll wasn't dead, but it sure was different. So, what really changed, in your opinion?
Well, if you think of how things evolve and every musical movement is a reaction to what came before it. So, as you said, in the '70s, rock and roll bands of Foreigner and the Eagles are private planes and going big and making a fortune. So, the reaction to that is mid to late '70s punk rock of the Ramones and playing in little clubs again, getting back to being dirty and loud and simple like the Beatles were in the early days. And then we get disco and we get a whole different era. And out of that comes the Euro rock pop that we talked about of synthesizers in the '80s. Then the reaction to that, as you said, Guns N' Roses come, we get back to guitars. And then the rebirth of it all happens with grunge, with people singing about their pain from their heart and soul. A lot of the bands are terrific, but Pearl Jam and Nirvana were heads and shoulders above everyone else,
Above everyone
singing
else.
about being disaffectation. How do we fit into this world? Because I don't understand it, and I don't see where I fit. And if there's a 17-year-old anywhere in the world who isn't
They
asking
relate.
themselves that question, when you hear that in any era, you go, "Oh, wow, I'm not alone." Because no matter how much I pretend to be part of the group, I feel like a dork. I feel like a dork asking a girl for a date. I feel like a dork around my parents.
Yeah.
I try to do whatever the crowd is doing to feel like I belong, but I feel like I really don't belong. And just like the Beatles to the Who singing about it to grunge, like that music will always live on. And that's the magic of rock and roll. It wasn't a fad. It goes up in popularity, it goes down, but the heartbeat of it, that
It's
stays.
always there. Yeah, and rock and rollers, well, you're right, and when you look at it in retrospect, rock and rollers who came before, currently, they say we don't recognize our modern day contemporaries who sound wildly different to the classic rock and roll sound, right? And for audiences, rock and roll was basically anything with a guitar. And while there was the occasional, charting rock and roll song, the genre in general had fallen further from its mainstream glory that it enjoyed decades earlier. And to cut to where we are today, I mean, you have old school rockers that are now grandparents. They've released new work, most notably Bruce Springsteen and Elvis Costello. But for the next generation, they're safely in the hands of Youngblood and Machine Gun Kelly, just to name a few. Where does rock and roll go from here?
You know what? I've been asked that so many times, and the answer is I have no idea, none whatsoever. The only thing that I wonder about is what is it exactly that it's going to be? I look forward to the next iteration of it. Right now, pop music is back to where it was in the 50s.
Yeah,
And that sounds like I'm putting the artist down, but I'm not at all. You have a sound, you have a look, and you just do that. And there are exceptions, of course. I'm not pigeonholing anybody, but for the most part, I hear everything sounding very, very similar. And I ask the audience, if you don't see the performer with all the auto tuning, with the music being made by a computer and auto tuning of the voices, if you didn't see the artist, can you be sure which female pop singer you're actually listening to? Because
exactly.
the differences are so similar because it's all done by the idea is not to sound unique. The idea is to sound the same because it's a similar sound that's wanted. And hopefully the pendulum swings back again from that and we have something that's unique and something that's sounds different that people grab onto because you get bored with this and you find something else.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for coming
Oh,
on, my friend. That was so enlightening chatting with you. I mean, I feel like we packed a lot in there.
we sure did. And if I can put in a plug, yeah, thank you for mentioning afternoons. But Sunday morning, when we do Breakfast with the Beatles on the air, Q104.3, and over on the iHeart Radio app, we have about 30% of our listeners are under 18.
Yeah,
And that's my favorite
fascinating.
part of the world is that new listeners are finding this. A 12-year-old girl said, "Ken, could you play George Harrison? He's so sexy."
I
And I
love
thought,
that.
he is sexy. His body may be gone, he's physically gone, but what he left in this world, this handsome, beautiful man in these spiritual songs, "Beware of Darkness," and "Here Comes the Sun," something in the
Yeah,
way she moves, that'll always be sexy. That lives
you're right.
forever.
It does. Well, thank you so much, Ken. You're amazing.
Oh, you are too. It's a joy to call you my friend.
Oh, you're so sweet. Guys, you definitely have to check out the amazing Ken Dashow, Q104.3 afternoon drive host. And of course, Sunday morning breakfast with the Beatles. You definitely don't want to miss him there. That was our entertainment and pop culture segment. Now, where rock and roll goes next is anyone's guess, like Ken said. Some argue the genre died decades ago, while others are certain it's still very much alive and well. And one thing is for sure that rock and roll has given us too many gifts to count and shaped our culture in more ways than we can imagine. So for that, we say thank you to the rockers that came before. That was our entertainment and pop culture segment brought to you by Animoca Brands. You're listening to A Moment of Zen right here on 710 WOR, the voice of New York, iHeart Radio. We'll be right back after this.
A Moment of Zen is brought to you by Animoca Brands. As a worldwide industry leader in digital entertainment, blockchain, and digital property rights, Animoca Brands plays a key role in the future growth of the open metaverse. During unstable times like these in burgeoning industries similar to blockchain, it's important to realize that blockchain can and will survive and eventually flourish, and industry-leading companies like Animoca Brands will guide the transformation into the future. Animoca Brands will keep building a better and fairer Web3 ecosystem, create impact for better, and bring true digital property rights to all internet users through NFTs and the open metaverse. For more information and to become part of the excitement, go to animocabrands.com. That's animocabrands.com.